Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another day of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the educators here at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, and I'm so excited you are joining us today because we are going to explore the wild world of food webs. Now, you might be familiar with that term food web, or it might be new to you, but don't worry. We're going to go over a couple vocabulary to help us understand what a food web is and all the players in it, and then we're going to explore a food web in this habitat. So this right here is a kelp forest. This one is Blue Cavern, hello fish, which is here at the aquarium. We have a lot of webcams in our exhibits here. So we're going to use this kelp forest to help us build out a food web. And I'm going to draw it out. So if you have paper and pencils or markers or crayons and you want to draw along with me, you are more than welcome to. Now we're not going to be drawing till a little bit later in the program. So if you want to take this time to go grab your supplies, that would be a great idea. Now, before we do get started, I want to let you know that we have some ways for you to participate with us besides drawing along today. So we have a text line. We would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions or you want to share your observations or your thoughts, or you just want to say hi, good morning to us here in the studio, I'm not alone. I've got Ty, who's controlling everything you see behind me. You can text us in at 562-286-1838. And we can take those texts. Ty will send them over to me, and then we'll be able to answer your questions or share your observations. Now, if you're watching this program live, so it's Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. on July 6th, you can go ahead and text us. Now, if you're watching after the fact, we still would love to hear from you and be able to answer your questions, but we're going to ask that you email us at this email address just below that phone number, and that email address is live@lbaop.org. Now, we'll keep this banner up for a while. It might go away, and then we'll bring it back, but it's going to be there in case you remember or think that you have some questions or observations you want to share, but you don't remember that phone number. Don't worry, it'll be here for you. All right, everyone, are you ready to get started? All right, so we are going to explore a food web today. Now, does anyone know what a food web is? Let's think for a minute. A food web. So there's going to be food webs in every habitat or every home where animals live, every place where animals live and animals interact and animals survive. We're going to be able to create a food web. Now, if you're thinking it has something to do with what animals eat, you are absolutely correct, right? That keyword food in there helps us. So a food web is basically who eats who in a habitat. That's a pretty simple way to look at it. It's a little more complicated, a little bit more complex, because it's actually the transfer of energy within a habitat or an ecosystem. So if we're looking at our kelp forest here, and we think about how energy moves through this habitat, our food web can help us kind of draw out where the energy moves. Now, every living thing needs energy in order to survive and do things. And so that energy gets transferred from animal to animal or thing to thing as they're eating and consuming other animals. So we are going to draw, we are going to build out a food web based on our kelp forest. Now, there's a couple players that we want to make sure that we are including in our kelp forest. So I'm going to use my whiteboard, and I'm going to write out a couple of our terms just so we can get a visual of what these things are. So our first thing is a primary producer. Now, that word primary, that means first. So the first producer. Now, what a producer is, it's an animal that uses the sun for energy, or something that uses the sun for energy. So if we go back and look at our kelp forest, and if you think a moment, what in this habitat is going to be using the sun for energy? Any ideas? We've got lots of fish swimming around in here. We've also got all this green, brown stuff. Any idea what that is? That's right, that's the kelp. So the kelp in this habitat is going to be our primary producer. So plants who use photosynthesis, they use the sunlight for energy. They are often the primary producers because they're taking that sun, they are using it for energy, and then they're going to be sort of the basis of that food web or food chain because other animals are going to eat it, and that's where that energy transfer is going to start. So primary producers, they use the sun for energy. Now, our next term, we're going to use primary again. So it's going to be the first. We'll put first here so we know it's first. But we've moved on to consumer. Now that's an interesting word, consumer. Have we heard that word before? You might hear it like you consume or you take in something, right? When we eat food, we are consuming that food. So a primary consumer is going to be the first animal to eat that primary producer. So if we're looking at our kelp forest, which we'll come back to, think about what animal might be the first one to eat the primary producer, which is the kelp. So we've got the primary producer, the thing that uses the sun for energy to help it grow. And then we've got the primary consumer, which is the first thing that eats that primary producer. And then we'll go one more level. We could continue on, but we'll go one more level up. And we'll go to our secondary consumer. Now, secondary, like second, means two, the second one. So guess what the secondary consumer does? That's right. It eats the primary consumer. So our secondary consumer is going to eat this thing, which eats this thing. So that creates more of a food chain. But when we start to draw ours out, we'll see that our web is tangled. So you may have heard of a food chain before where it's one animal, next, and it creates just a line. But a food web is a little bit more tangled. There's a lot more players in it. And we are going to draw out our food web for our kelp forest. Now, I said we've been watching Blue Cavern here, but I'm going to have Ty move us lower down into our exhibit. So right now, we are taking what we call a snorkeler's view. It's almost like we're at the top of our exhibit looking down into this kelp forest. But I'm going to have him take us down into our exhibit. So we're going to look lower down into our kelp forest, and we're going to take a moment to make some observations of this habitat before we start to build out our kelp forest food web. All right, so this is Blue Cavern. This is our lower viewing. So let's take a moment and just make some observations. But I want you to keep in mind that primary producer, primary consumer, and secondary consumer. So what animals do you think eat what in this habitat that's going to help us build out our food web? So let's take a moment to make some observations. What do you notice? Now that term observation, you might be familiar with it, or it might be a new term for you. But scientists use observations when we're trying to learn or study something. And what's cool about observations is you don't need any tools or prior knowledge to make an observation because you're using your senses, like your sight, and you're going to look and just describe what you see. So if I were making an observation of this kelp forest, I would say there's a very large fish right here in front of us right now. And I notice that this fish has some spots on its body. Did you make similar observations? So Ty put up that text line. So if you want to share your observations with us, go ahead and text us at 562-286-1838. And let's take maybe another minute to make a couple more observations. Excellent. Are you making those observations? Now we had Ella and Everett text in, and they think that sea urchins are a primary consumer in this habitat. And I will tell you, you are absolutely correct. And sea urchins are a really important player in our kelp forest habitat and in our food web. So we will make sure to include urchins, just like you mentioned, Ella and Everett. Thank you for texting us in. So let's start building so we can explain how sea urchins fit into this food web and why they fill that role of primary consumer. Now, before we get to our consumers, we need to think about our primary producers. But even before that, we need to draw the sun. So I'm going to use my whiteboard, and I'm going to use that to draw. Now, like I said, if you have paper or if you have a whiteboard, you can draw along. Or if you don't feel like drawing, that's totally fine too. You can just watch. So I'm going to draw the sun right up here. Nice yellow sun. Shining bright, not like it was this morning. It was pretty cloudy on my drive-in this morning, but hopefully wherever you are, the sun is shining. So we've got the sun. But in our kelp forest habitat, what is the primary producer? What is using the sun to help it grow? Well, I kind of gave it away. We said it before. It's going to be that kelp. So I'm going to take a green. Actually, I'm going to use brown only because when I hold up my picture, our green screen will make our kelp disappear. So kelp can kind of be greenish, brownish, sometimes kind of reddish. It kind of has a lot of different colors or tones to it. But I'm going to draw a long stalk of kelp. I'm going to draw the little, these are called nematocysts. They're little air bubbles that help our kelp float to the surface so it can reach the sun better. And then it almost looks like it's got leaves. But for kelp, because it's an algae, it's not a plant, we call them blades. Now, plants in a lot of ecosystems, like grasses or flowers, they can be considered the primary producer. But in the ocean, a lot of times it's algae. Now you might be wondering, what is the difference between plants and algae? Well, one of the biggest differences is things like kelp, which is an algae, they don't have a root system. If you think about grass or flowers, they dig into the dirt and that helps anchor them. And that can help them get a little bit of nutrients, but it also makes sure they're not going to move too much. But algae, they don't have that root system. So they don't dig into the sand or into a rock. Instead, for kelp, it's going to attach onto a rock. It's called a holdfast is how it holds on. And it kind of looks like a tangle of roots. So I'm actually going to draw a little rock here on the bottom. We'll do a black rock like that. And then I'm going to use my brown again to make that hold fast. So it's sort of like a tangle of roots. It looks very similar to roots, but it's exposed. It doesn't dig in anywhere. And it doesn't help the kelp get any nutrients. It just helps anchor it. So that if a big wave comes, this kelp is not going to float away. So we've got our first part of this food web. We have our primary producer. The kelp is using the sun for energy to help it grow. All right, now we need that primary consumer. And Ellen Everett mentioned sea urchins. So I want to see if Ty, I'm going to give a minute, can put up a picture of a sea urchin in case you're not familiar with this animal. Ta-da! Have you seen this before? If you live in Southern California and you've been to tide pools, or you live anywhere where there's tide pools, you've likely encountered these animals before. Now, it might look kind of scary, this spiky ball, but sea urchins are actually a really nice animal. They don't move very much, and if we're gentle, we can touch them without them hurting us. Their spines are just so they stay safe. They're not like a porcupine. They don't stick us with their spines like a porcupine would with their quills. Their spines are just to make it look like they're scarier, but we can touch them really gently and they won't hurt us. But you can see here in this picture that the sea urchin is sitting on top of a blade of kelp. That's right. They're sitting on a blade of kelp because kelp is our sea urchin's favorite thing to eat. It's pretty much all they eat. They will eat other things if they have to, but if given the choice, kelp is what a sea urchin is going to eat. Now you might be wondering, where is the mouth of the sea urchin? It's on the very bottom. We'll see if Ty can find a picture. We have a picture where they're stuck on the glass here at the aquarium and you can see their mouth in the middle, but it's on the very bottom, and sea urchins only have 5 teeth. That's right, only 5. They're shaped kind of like this, and they use that to munch through the kelp. So they just kind of munch around. Now, they'll eat the blades like this, but their favorite thing to eat is that holdfast, that bottom part of the kelp. So sea urchins love to eat kelp. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a red. So urchins, like we see in this picture, can be purple, but we also have red urchins here, and I'm using red only because I can't find my purple marker. Now, as we're coloring today, you can color things in any color you want. It can be the same as me, or it can be your favorite color. So you don't have to follow exactly. So I'm going to use red to draw some sea urchins. And they're going to be really fancy sea urchins, literally just spiky circles. Here's our sea urchins. Just like that. Lots of spikes all around. I erased part of my hold fast. Now, eventually, once we draw all the animals that we're going to do, we'll add in some arrows so we can see who's eating what and where that energy moves around this habitat. But so far, we've got our sun giving energy to our kelp, which is our primary producer. Now we've got a primary consumer, the sea urchins eating the kelp. But I want you to think, are urchins the only animals that eat kelp? I wonder. Now, we've got a couple questions come in. So while you think about my question, I'm going to go over to our questions that came in. So Schmidt Elementary asked, how tall can kelp grow? That is a great question. It can grow really, really tall. So in perfect conditions, which means the water is nice and cold and it's really rich in nutrients, kelp can grow about 2 feet a day. So think about that. In just a couple days, it outgrow most of us. And it can live about 60 feet deep in the water and grow all the way to the surface. So it can grow about 60 feet or more. Now, think about it. If kelp is down 60 feet and it grows towards the surface, it doesn't hit the surface of the water and stop growing. But what it does is it ends up hitting the water surface and it folds over and it creates a canopy. And then it keeps growing, so it can be even taller than about 60 feet, but that's about as tall as it would stand. And then it folds over and it creates a canopy. And that canopy can be really important because it provides shelter for a lot of, look at this. It can provide shelter for a lot of animals, and it also provides a place for birds to land on. So that's right. Sometimes you might see birds sitting on something that looks like it's floating in the ocean, and oftentimes that's part of the canopy of a kelp forest, and birds use it as a place to rest. also maybe a place to find some snacks. So here we see kelp in their natural habitat out in the ocean. And you see these long stalks of the kelp growing up towards the sun at the surface. All right, so we've got another question. So Miguelito Elementary observed that sharks will eat smaller fish in a kelp forest. Ooh, excellent, sharks. So you're right, sharks will eat smaller fish. So we'll make sure that we add fish and sharks into our habitat. Now, this here is another kelp forest here at the aquarium. This one is called Amber Forest, and if you come visit us, it's just to the right of our blue cavern exhibit, but it's another kind of kelp forest. We've got a lot of fish in here. There is one shark. I'm not sure if we see the shark coming through in here eventually, but keep an eye, you might see a leopard shark, but we have 4 leopard sharks living in Blue Cavern, and then 1 living in here. So we've got fish in here, we've got more kelp, we've got sharks. There's also another animal to take a look at right here, our eel. This is my favorite because our eel is acting like the kelp, helping it to blend in. Oh, there's a shark. Excellent. So that is a leopard shark. So you're right, sharks might eat smaller fish living in the kelp forest, or they might eat some other animals as well. Ooh, what do you see back here too? Take a look right there. Ooh, what's that? A sea star. Now, sea stars eat a variety of things, but there are some sea stars like those bat stars who will also eat things like algae. Now, it might not be the algae specifically like kelp, but there's other algae growing in a habitat. So I'm going to draw some sea stars, and I'm going to have them pretending like they're eating the kelp, but it's just representing algae. So I'm going to draw some blue sea stars. That's right, sea stars can be blue. We've got some blue sea stars here at the aquarium. So I'm going to draw a couple sea stars. I guess bat stars have a little shorter arms. Draw a couple more sea stars as another player. Now, if the sea stars are also eating algae, that would make them what? That's right, that would make them a primary consumer, just like the urchins. All right, so far we've got 2 primary consumers. We have our primary producer, and we have the sun. But we need to start adding some secondary consumers, don't you think? So let's think. What animals might eat urchins, or even sea stars, or even other algae that are in a habitat in a kelp forest? Now, you mentioned before that there's little fish, and you're right. Some fish will eat algae. Some fish with little small mouths might eat all the algae that grow on rocks, helping keep that habitat clean. So we can draw some little fish who are eating algae. I'm going to draw some little orange fish. Little fish. And then there's actually some fish who also eat some larger things like our sea urchins as well. Ooh, lost our picture. We actually have some fish who eat our sea urchins as well. So our fish right here that are eating algae, that would make them a primary consumer. But if the fish are eating things like urchins, that would make them a secondary consumer because they're eating the urchins, which are eating the algae. So I'm going to have Ty bring up a picture of a California sheephead. Ta-da! Now, this is a fish that is known to eat the sea urchins, making this fish a secondary consumer in this habitat. Now, I think these fish are fascinating. They're really cool. And when I'm looking at this fish, I can tell you that this fish is a male, but it's working its way to be a male. Now, that might sound really confusing, but sheephead are a really interesting fish. When all sheephead are born, they're all female. So every sheephead egg that hatches is a female. And then what happens is there's a change in the body of the fish. There's a chemical change, and the most strongest, the most dominant female actually transitions into a male. And not only do they change, but their body color and shape changes. So if we look at this fish here, the color is of a male. If it was a female, its whole body would be this pink color. But as a male, it has a black tail and kind of a blackish face. But why I know that this one is sort of in that transition is the shape of the body changes as well, including the shape of the head. So a male sheephead has much more of a square head, just like this one. Do you see the difference? Maybe it's a little bit subtle. You might have to kind of look at the 2 pictures a little bit, but take a look at this big bump on its head right here. So this kind of square block head is a characteristic of a male sheephead. And the females, they don't have that block or bump on their head. Their body's a little bit more sort of rounded and smooth, and they're all one color. And then the male, the most dominant female, transitions into a male and gets this black on the front and back of its body, this pink stripe in the middle, and their head changes. It's really interesting. This transition can also happen when there's a lot of food. So if there's a lot of sea urchins around for these animals to eat, then all the females get really strong, and then they may transition as well. So sometimes if you go snorkeling, you might see a lot more males in the area, and that means that there's a lot of food, a lot of sea urchins for them to eat. Now I'm going to draw, I see we've got some more questions coming in. I'm going to draw the sheephead, and then we'll get to their questions. So the easiest way that I think to draw a sheephead is starting with a rectangle. Because they've got that kind of block body. So from the rectangle, I'm going to take the tail. I'm going to kind of pinch it a little bit, and then they've got this kind of broom-shaped tail like that, and make a little bit of texture into it. And then I'm going to make a little slant for the front, but make sure we've got that kind of block head. And then if you notice, we'll go back to a picture in just a sec, they've got sort of a frowny face, as many fish do, but their lower jaw is white. Let's take a look at the sheephead again. Look at that. So if we look at both pictures, we'll see the lower jaw is white, and then you can even see a little tiny tooth sticking out. Now they have very big teeth because they are eating sea urchins, which are hard and crunchy and spiky, so they need those really strong teeth. But you will see this white lower jaw. Now if we look at the male, it also has that white lower jaw, and this one looks a little bit grumpier too. So take a look at their jaw. We'll also look at their fins here, and they've got some fins back here, and then their fin is kind of stuck down, but there's a tiny fin here at the top. So if I go back over to my fish, I'm going to draw little lines because that's where it's going to be red. Color it in red. And then that fin that was right here at the bottom was sort of like a pinkish color. So we'll draw a fin there, little fin from the other side. The fins that we saw back here. Fin at the top. I'm just erasing all the things. Fin. We'll do a fin here in the middle. We need an eye for our fish so that it can see. And here is our grumpy sheephead. So our sheephead is going to be our secondary consumer eating our sea urchins. There's also our sea stars, which are eating the kelp just like the urchins, and our fish, which are also eating everything we've got here. So we're creating that food web. Now, if we start to draw arrows in our food web, let's take another color to draw our arrows. We'll take another blue. So the sun is providing energy for the kelp. And then the kelp is feeding who? That's right, it's feeding the urchins. It's feeding the sea stars. And it could be feeding the fish as well, right? There might be some fish who are eating. And then we've got fish who are eating the urchins. So the urchins are feeding two different fish. Now, there's a lot more players we could add to our kelp forest, but you're starting to see how it's not just one line, but it creates a web, a tangled web of all these animals eating different things. All right, we've got a couple more questions, so I'm going to have Ty put us back into Blue Cavern, and you start thinking about other animals to add. Oh, we have to add the shark. All right, start thinking about adding our shark, and we'll add it just after we answer this question. So Ella and Everett ask, are sea otters secondary consumers? Ooh, excellent question. Sea otters. Now, sea otters are another important player in a kelp forest habitat. Now, if we're looking at Blue Cavern, this is one of our local habitats, our local kelp forests. So that secondary consumer line, the thing that eats sea urchins, is going to be our sheephead. And I didn't add sea otters because that's not a local animal to us here. But if we are thinking about a kelp forest in Northern California, which I actually just got back from a vacation in Northern California, and I saw lots and lots of sea otters snacking on lots of crunchy things like urchins and crabs. And our sea otters would absolutely be that secondary consumer because they're going to be eating things like urchins, who are the primary consumer, who are eating kelp, which is our primary producer. So excellent job, Ella and Everett. You put together that our otter would fill that secondary consumer role because it would be eating things like our sea urchins. Now, if you would like to add a sea otter to your food web, you are more than welcome to. I am not the best drawer. I am not going to add a sea otter only because I will just embarrass myself drawing it. But I bet you all out there are much better drawers than I am. So you are more than welcome to add that sea otter to your food web. Now, Schmidt Elementary wants to know how many urchins live in a kelp forest. Oh, Excellent question. Now, this is kind of an interesting question. I don't have a specific number for you, but that number fluctuates, which means it can go up or down a lot. And it depends on things like those secondary consumers. So when we talk about sheephead or we talk about otters, you might hear them called keystone species. Now, that's a really big word, but you may have heard it before or it might be new. A keystone species is an animal in a food web or in an ecosystem that if we remove that animal, it causes massive destruction to that food web. Now, if we go back to our food web and we look at it, or if you look at any food web, if we were to take out something like, say, the sea stars, these sea stars, the habitat might look a little bit different, but it won't change it too much because there are other things that are eating what the sea star eats, and there's other things that might eat sea stars that could find other food to eat. But if we take out a keystone species, like our sheephead or sea otter, it will dramatically change what that habitat looks like. And the reason for this is sheephead and otters eat urchins. Urchins eat kelp, that's right. Now, if there are no sheephead or there are no otters, that means that there's no predators, nothing to eat the urchins. Now, the urchins are like, this is a great day. There's no one here to eat me. And they start reproducing, and then there's so many urchins, which is great for the urchins. However, what do the urchins eat? The kelp. So if there's too many urchins, the urchins are all going to eat the kelp. And then what happens to the kelp? That's right. It disappears completely, especially because urchins' favorite part is that holdfast. And so they'll eat this bottom part. This part will drift away, and it destroys that kelp forest and all the other animals that live there. So if we take out our keystone species, it can drastically change what that habitat looks like because without a sheephead, there's nothing to keep a balance of urchins. And so the urchins run rampant, they keep growing, they keep eating, and they eat all the kelp forests. And we get something called an urchin barren, which means it's just urchins and pretty much nothing else. There's no kelp, so there's no other animal that might live in a kelp forest. So I don't know a specific number of how many urchins we find in a kelp forest, but we need some urchins because sometimes kelp can keep growing and growing and growing, and then there's no room for any animal or anything else. But we don't need too many urchins because if there's too many urchins, then it would create that imbalance. It would eat all the kelp. So we need a healthy number of urchins, which sadly I don't know what that number looks like. But we need some urchins, but we don't need too many urchins to keep a balanced ecosystem. All right, now before we end, we've got a couple minutes left. We want to make sure we draw our shark. So I'm going to have Ty put up a picture of a leopard shark really quick so we can get some inspiration. All right, so they've got a really long body. They've got this pattern covering their body. That's how we know it's a leopard shark. And they've got some fins. All right, here we're going to give it my best go. So they've got kind of this long, kind of skinnier, oval-shaped body. They've got some fins, right? They've got their mouth and eye. It's a very happy leopard shark. Let's go back to the leopard shark for a sec, get some more inspiration. It's not looking great. Excellent. All right, so we've got the fins on the side. Fins here, and then the tail. Okay, we can go back. Its tail, like that. A little shark mouth. Oh, this is looking real rough. I can draw a much better shark. One more time. We'll start over. Leopard sharks, their mouth is more towards the bottom of their body. And so they eat very specific things. They're going to eat things they can find on the bottom of their habitat. So they might be eating all these crunchy things that live towards the bottom. So I'm going to draw a little mouth on the bottom here. And then we're going to draw that saddle pattern, all those spots. Little dots on my shark. Its fins. All right, here is my leopard shark. All right, our leopard shark lives in our kelp forest, and it could be eating all these crunchy, smaller things that live there. So maybe it's going to snack on an animal like a sea star. Maybe it's going to eat a fish. So we can see how that web continues to grow and gets more and more complicated the more that we add more players into our habitat. All right, let's go back to Blue Cavern. Excellent. So thank you so much for joining us today. We drew our food web. I'll grab my food web. You can hold your food webs up, or we love to see your drawing. So if you drew a food web and you'd like to share it with us, we'll put up that text line again, and you can take a picture and text us and share your artwork with us, because we love seeing you participate with us and draw things, even if it's just our food web, to help us understand the way that energy moves in this habitat. Who eats who? It looks like I'm going to get eaten by this giant sea bass right here. Oh, and there's our shark as well, and all these other animals that we drew in our food web. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.